CNN fired their contributor, Marc Lamont Hill, for his outrageous comments about Israel.
Supporters of Israel interpreted that Hill was using coded language to hide his desire to destroy the state of Israel.
A free Palestine from the river to the sea.
I don't think that it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel.
CNN, how are they protecting the free speech of their own journalists?
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're tracking this week. Testing the limits of free speech in the land of the free. When discussing Israel and Palestine on American television, choose your words carefully. An Arab-Israeli broadcaster takes the complaints of a critic and puts them to song. Taxman. Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte is the latest leader to go after a news organization over alleged tax evasion. And post-colonial broadcasting in Peru, news in pre-colonial languages. We begin with the fractious issue of Palestine and Israel in the U.S. news media, the boundaries around that discussion, who gets to set them, and what ultimately is allowed to be said. Last week, a CNN contributor, a commentator the network had on its payroll, delivered a speech at the United Nations in support of Palestinian self-determination and equal rights. Less than 24 hours later, CNN was done with Marc Lamont Hill. When you boil it down, he was fired for using the following 6 words, from the river to the sea. That was deemed anti-Semitic. Hill's dismissal came on the heels of a seemingly coordinated attack by pro-Israel groups that have come to have a large say over what constitutes acceptable discourse on Palestine in the U.S. by willfully conflating legitimate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and then convincing news outlets to do the same. It wasn't that long ago that CNN adopted the slogan, facts first. When it comes to Israel, though, it's much more complicated than that. Some facts are clearly more inconvenient than others. Our starting point this week is the UN's headquarters in New York City.
It is with great honor and humility that I accept the opportunity to speak before you.
The speech lasted 21 minutes and 7 seconds.
The Israeli nation-state continues to restrict freedom and undermine equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as those in the West Bank and Gaza.
It consisted of 2,837 words.
I promise you that I will not exhaust all of my time by enumerating every human rights violation perpetrated by the Israeli government.
Had the speech been 6 words shorter, Marc Lamont Hill would still be employed by CNN. Had he ended it like this.
Give us what justice requires, and that is a free Palestine.
Instead, he chose to end it like this.
A free Palestine from the river to the sea.
When Marc Lamont Hill says a free Palestine from the river to the sea, he is acknowledging that Palestinians aren't just clustered in the West Bank and Gaza, but in fact we are from places like Akka and Jaffa and Majdad and the Galilee and all parts of Palestine. And the significance of this is that Israel has always sought to erase this historic fact. They're not just objecting to use of the words from the river to the sea, but Palestine.
Now, I understand why the vagueness of that term may lead some to misinterpret it. I understand that somebody who identifies as a pro-Israel Zionist may have an issue with a one-state vision because equal rights for everyone would effectively mean the end of the Jewish state, a state that privileges the Jewish population over the non-Jewish population. That's why we see people resorting to a smear campaign.
So CNN not only had every right to fire him, this was a piece of open anti-Semitism.
Effectively misdirecting what those words actually mean.
That's right out of a Hamas script that calls for the annihilation of Israel.
That is not what that phrase means at all.
People decided to zoom in on what was supposedly the true subtext of what he's saying. It's an active search to find a delegitimizing sentence that reveals some nefarious intent in a call for freedom. And we see that over and over again. And one of the main drivers to that force is the conflation between critique of Israel and anti-Semitism.
In the 20-minute speech, he said many righteous and important things about the plight of Palestinians. At the same time, if somebody gave a beautiful speech and then in the middle of it said the N-word, we would be right to sort of focus on that. Now again, I don't think that the phrase "from the river to the sea" is necessarily anti-Semitic, but it was interpreted that way by many Jews, and so I think it was fair to focus on that.
But how was that interpretation arrived at? The Anti-Defamation League, a Jewish NGO based in the US, said Lamont Hill's use of the phrase "from the river to the sea" meant that he was calling for the end of the State of Israel. The ADL describes itself as a civil rights organization that fights bigotry and anti-Semitism in the US. However, it has little or no tolerance for those who question Israeli government policies. Collectively, pro-Israel lobby groups in Washington, including the ADL, AIPAC, the Jewish Federation of America, and others, are the kings of conflation. They carry a lot of weight with politicians and the media alike. And when CNN saw the online pushback to what Lamont Hill had said, it just rolled over and cut him loose.
This is definitely an organized campaign that is attempting to misrepresent Hill's views. Somebody like Ben Shapiro, who is a host at Fox News right now, is openly an advocate of Israel ethnically cleansing Palestinians from the Palestinian territories. Seth Mandel, who is the editor of the Washington Examiner, made the most egregious charge against Hill, accusing him of advocating for genocide. And CNN, by caving to the smear campaign, is absolutely playing into the hands of people who want to make the conflation and are undermining free speech in the process.
There's definitely a problem right now in the public sphere where some versions of anti-Zionism or opposition to Israel are immediately called by some on the right anti-Semitic. This is, of course, a huge problem. In terms of what Marc Lamont Hill said, I think CNN was thinking probably about its viewers and about the Jewish community and saying, well, the majority of the community viewed this as deeply problematic, as something that threatens their very existence, and so they made the decision based on that.
CNN essentially perpetuated this narrative, this false dichotomy, this idea that you have to choose. Don't critique Israel or be anti-Semitic. It's even more problematic because of the positive role that it could play in this conflict and this narrative. That discussion will not be on CNN because they fired Dr. Hill. But that will be a perfect place and a perfect opportunity to have this discussion.
Michael Oren is with us. With us now from Massachusetts, Professor Alan Dershowitz.
Rick Santorum, thanks so much for being here, Senator.
Thank you, Jay.
CNN's treatment of the Middle East conflict can be measured not just in the pro-Israel voices it pays to provide punditry, like the former Israeli ambassador to Washington, Michael Oren, ex-US Senator Rick Santorum, and lawyer Alan Dershowitz, but in the airtime they are given.
Israel wants peace.
Even the Anti-Defamation League has said Oren's opinions verge on conspiracy theories, yet he's still a paid CNN contributor and is often interviewed by Wolf Blitzer. Blitzer's bio on CNN's news site is as revealing about the network as it is about him. It's an extensive and detailed summary of a career going back 40 years. But nowhere does CNN mention
Now I'd like to address Mr. Blitzer.
that in the 1980s, Blitzer worked at AIPAC. He was a paid lobbyist for Israel.
For all of us should be delighted that we happen to be around at a time in this world when there is this Israel.
We wrote to CNN with a series of questions on this story, but did not hear back. And Wolf Blitzer is not just another face on the network. He is CNN's lead political anchor.
It's institutional. It's embedded in the fabric of CNN. They bolster it with guests like Michael Oren
Israel will take whatever measures are necessary to defend its citizens.
and Rick Santorum, for example, denying that Palestinians even exist.
And all the people that live in the West Bank are Israelis. They're not Palestinians. There is no Palestinian.
All these people get to stay on CNN, and Wolf Blitzer, who is, an ardent Zionist and with a history of working for the Israeli lobby, he gets to frame the story. And rarely do Palestinians ever get a voice on CNN.
It is really interesting to compare the discourse about Israel and Palestine among Israelis and among Americans. When I moved to the United States, I was surprised that the word occupation was uncomfortable to some. pro-Israel advocates.
I don't buy the whole idea that the United Nations is calling it an occupation. I mean, this is Israel.
In Israel, you do have people talking about the occupation. Until there is a movement in the establishment of the United States politics that can utter these words, that can say, what is the problem that we need to solve? And that will be very far from a solution.
The pro-Israel lobby's work to influence American political discourse extends into academia. The Canary Mission is a website that compiles dossiers on pro-Palestinian college students and professors in the U.S. Some of those named on it say it's akin to a blacklist designed to intimidate them into silence. Al Jazeera has investigated the site, but that documentary has yet to be broadcast, leading some to speculate that even Al Jazeera is not immune to pressure from the pro-Israel lobby in the U.S., which the network denies. Professor Marc Lamont Hill, an academic now deposed from the media platform CNN gave him, would know both sides of that story. But, as of this writing, he's not talking, which is the whole point of the exercise.
It is crucial for people to understand the magnitude of the threat to free speech in the form of denying the ability of pro-Palestine activists to be part of the narrative in the United States. This takes many forms. We are facing a very serious threat to free speech in the form of denying the right to speak honestly about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the right to advocate on it.
Another media story that's on our radar this week is unfolding in the Philippines. It's one we've been following for a couple of years now, the case of President Rodrigo Duterte versus Rappler, a news website that's been the president's bête noire for its critical coverage of his government's war on drugs and its online disinformation campaign. Earlier this year, Rappler's license was temporarily revoked, and just last week, the site and its founder, Maria Ressa, were indicted for tax evasion, which raised more than a few eyebrows. Maria Ressa joins us on the Listening Post now to discuss this case and President Duterte's approach to dealing with his critics in the news media. Ms. Ressa, Rappler is not the first news outlet critical of a government to suddenly develop quote-unquote tax issues. We've heard similar stories in Turkey, for instance. Is the case against you and Rappler politically motivated?
Absolutely. I mean, I've run out of synonyms for the word ridiculous for the foundation of a lot of these multiple legal cases that we're now facing.
Do you have any faith that the justice system in the Philippines can deal with this case without folding under political pressure?
I continue to have faith in the individual men and women inside the judiciary. I mean, obviously the fact that the cases have been filed show political pressure. We have a very powerful executive. President Duterte controls not just the executive branch, he has a supermajority in Congress and the legislature. He also, by the time he leaves office, will have appointed 13 of 15 Supreme Court justices, right? All we can do is, expect the worst, but hope for the best.
We've seen all those comparisons between Duterte's approach to the news media and President Trump's, but when the Trump administration goes after the U.S. media, whether it's revoking the credentials of a CNN White House correspondent or simply calling journalism that the president doesn't like fake news, it gets a lot of flack in return from other news organizations and lots of ordinary Americans. Are we seeing enough of that in the Philippines? Because none of this really seems to be hurting President Duterte politically.
I think you'll be surprised. The biggest difference between the United States and the Philippines is the strength of the institutions in the United States. But despite our weak institutions in the Philippines, what we feel in Rappler is that more of our supporters are coming out precisely because it's not just about one news group. It's not just about journalism. You're talking about values and principles of our Constitution. And I always say that if our people do not hold government accountable for crossing the line, then when it does, this country will no longer be a democracy. I think that's part of what's at stake here. So it's a tough time.
Maria Ressa, thank you. To Peru now, where 45% of the population is indigenous, but where the media have long failed to reflect the demographic facts. And it starts with language. Spanish dominates the airwaves there. But over the past year, the country's public broadcaster, Canal Peru, has launched 2 new news programs in the 2 main indigenous languages, Aymara and Quechua. The following report is on one of those programs. It's in Quechua, and it's called Nucanchic, or Us. Quechua is the most widely spoken indigenous language in the Americas. Almost 15% of Peruvians speak it fluently. And its appearance on Canal Peru is being seen as an attempt, albeit overdue, to redress the racist legacies of the colonial era. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now from Lima with the journalists behind Nucanchic.
Switch on the TV in Peru, tune in to any of the big radio stations, open up a national newspaper, and the information citizens will get, the information they need, will be in a language that many of them might not understand, Spanish. Last year, however, the Peruvian state broadcaster started airing a news show that broke the mold. The news was being broadcast in Quechua, an indigenous language, one that many of its speakers would prefer to deny, in a country where the language you speak marks your class, highlights your economic status, and defines your prospects.
The very fact that this program is being broadcast means that Quechua speakers will lift their heads up and will be better informed, and they will no longer be ashamed of speaking Quechua.
Our language was seen as an embarrassment. It was frowned upon, and we were looked down on.
The significance of this news broadcast in Quechua is that it recognizes the fact that this is a multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic country.
Some people have complained they don't understand. Well, my only response is that finally they get what it's like to be a Quechua speaker in Peru, watching the national news in your own country, and not understanding because it's broadcast in a language that's not your own.
Nucanchic does more than just broadcast in a different language. The producers say their mission is to reflect a different reality, a perspective that isn't mainstream in Peru. So while the morning news in Spanish might be dominated by news on Lima politics, on Nucanchic, a significant proportion of the news is sourced from remote locations. There's a focus on the concerns of the farming population. All this and reports on government policy.
Fiscalía Mañacuchcan, Presidente Kaj, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, Manna, Fiyuntukmanta Yoxinampaj. Imapa Haikapaj, Chay Odebrecht Manta Empresankuna, Pulhita Chaski Kurachu.
Just because the program is in Quechua, it doesn't mean we're going to see just folk music and dance. These are important and valuable aspects of that culture, but its fundamental purpose is to address people's needs.
Nucanchic has a responsibility to report on inequalities on the ground. What does big business want? What does the state say about those big projects? What are they taking from our earth? What are we going to do with the profits from forests, the wood? It's our duty to tell these stories.
This is not the first time Peru's state TV has broadcast news in Quechua. Tawa Canal Lima Manta Pachá was a news broadcast in the early 70s that put Quechua on TV for the first time. The program came about as part of Plan Inca, a nationwide agrarian reform campaign carried out by the left-wing military government of General Juan Velasco Alvarado. Velasco declared in 1974 that there was, quote, no freedom of the press in Peru, only freedom of enterprises. He reined in what he saw as the elite media, established Quechua as an official language, and used the state broadcaster to promote equal rights for indigenous groups, a move derided as populist propaganda by his critics, but celebrated by many across the country who felt they'd been ignored for centuries. Even though Quechua became one of Peru's official languages in 1975, in the more than 4 decades since, it's rarely been given much airtime, either on national TV or radio. That means that those 4 million people, more than 10% of Peru's population, whose first language is Quechua, not Spanish, have a hard time understanding the news. The other side of this story has to do with narrative and those stereotypes that voices in the mainstream media apply to indigenous people that smack of racism and have provoked outrage in Peru and beyond. Take La Paisana Jacinta, Jacinta the Peasant, a show that claimed to be a comedy about an Andean indigenous woman living in the capital, Lima. La Paisana Jacinta became so popular with its viewers that it got its own weekday primetime slot on Frecuencia Latina, one of Peru's biggest private TV channels. But things are changing. A group of indigenous women from the Andean region of Cusco have been waging a long legal battle to get the show banned. Last month, they won. The judge ruled for the show to be taken off air and off YouTube.
There's Jacinta, the villager, Eleuterio, the peasant. There's thousands of characters like that in the public eye. At least today we've become more discerning, but we used to laugh at them. This went on for years, and nobody questioned it.
One of the great Western myths is that hygiene is synonymous with civilization. So by portraying a native Indian woman as unkempt, you position her in a kind of pre-modern wilderness. She is toothless, dirty, rough in her speech, and masculine in demeanor. This idea of the native Andean woman is reflected in news narratives because they always portray her as a victim. And this suggests that people like her are inadequate and ultimately unable to integrate into mainstream society.
I've realized just how subtle, how insidious linguistic discrimination can be. It's more complex and more serious than racial discrimination even, because it works by association. Spanish is associated with culture, and Quechua with ignorance.
For the commercial players in Peru's media market, the Quechua audience hasn't even been an afterthought. The language, the community, is scarcely represented on either private radio or TV. In a media ecosystem that depends on ad revenue, the Quechua segment of the audience simply doesn't qualify in terms of purchasing power or economic presence. Against that backdrop, Ñukanchik, along with Hiwasanaka, a news show in Aymara, Peru's other main indigenous language, are products in a market that rarely includes indigenous people.
Obviously, these issues made it very difficult for Quechua language programs to be produced for television. If Quechua speakers weren't going to purchase goods, there would be no advertising revenue, so that became a vicious cycle. As public broadcasters, we aren't so preoccupied with commercial matters. Our main concern is the public.
Our language wasn't recognized by the world of finance, so it was hardly featured on television or radio. We've broken that and proved that news can be produced in our language.
Un medio público.
Peru's national broadcaster has moved away from its old status as government mouthpiece. But it also differs from commercial TV, where the media are talking at the viewer, where the public's opinions about policies that could affect them is not taken into consideration. This is not the case on Ñukanchik, so we have taken an important first step. But I can't say that we're providing a platform in which power is being held to account with regards to national political issues. It could be in the future, and that would be a great thing.
Sería una cosa muy buena. And finally, back to Israel and the media. Born and raised in Nazareth, Lucy Aharish is in a category of one. She is the first Arab Muslim news presenter on a mainstream Israeli channel. A little more than a month ago, a viewer wrote in to complain about her habit of greeting her viewers in both Hebrew and Arabic, saying it was improper for the station to allow that, later adding that if she really wanted to speak Arabic, then, quote, let her go to Al Jazeera, which we can talk about. Ms. Aharish's husband, Tzahi Halevi, is an Israeli actor. He's Jewish and an amateur musician. So together with his wife, they took one of the viewers' letters and put it to song on the air. And if that Israeli letter writer happens to be watching, we've got one word for you: shalom. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
לוסי משדרת בערוץ ישראלי ואין הדבר יאה לאפשר לה לומר בערבית, גם אם דיבורה הוא קצרצר, רצוי כי מנהליה יעירו לה להפסיק את המנהג אותו יצרה לבדה מזה זמן. לברך בערבית, לברך בערבית, לברך בערבית, מסע אל חיר. לברך בערבית, לברך בערבית, לברך בערבית, מסע אל חיר.
مساء الخير مساء الخير مامي مساء الخير
تعيد جينات الطابق כבר مساء الخير הזה, יאללה.
מאמי, רק תדליק את הדוד, טוב?